Senate. More often than not, college commencement speakers are corporate CEOs or bankers or politicians. The people who will exercise control over students' futures by exploiting their labor, by piling mountains of student debt on them, and by starting endless wars that threaten the very futures of the students and their families. On October 5th, however, graduates of Goddard College undergraduate programs in Vermont had the rare opportunity to be addressed by a speaker of their choosing, whose message was incredibly important and meaningful, with whom they could identify, Mumia Abu-Jamal. Who was a student at the college in the late 1970s and a Goddard alum with a Bachelor's of Arts earned in 1996 while he was on Pennsylvania's death row. When news of Mumia's planned address became public, reactionary forces pressured the school to cancel the speech. The Fraternal Order of Police, the Vermont Police Chiefs Association, and the Vermont Troopers Association all denounced the school's administration and students. They were joined by Pennsylvania Senator Pat Toomey, Governor Tom Corbett, and the head of Pennsylvania's Department of Corrections. Conservative media pundits chimed in, as did much of the corporate media. There were hundreds of police-instigated threats of violence against the Goddard students. These included bomb threats and threats of sexual assault on students and the faculty unless they withdrew the invite. Think about it. Goddard College stood its ground, but proactively moved the graduation up 3 hours. On October 5th, Mumia delivered a 10-minute pre-recorded address to 24 graduating students and their families and faculty, while FOP members demonstrated outside the school as well as in Philadelphia. Realizing that many of the threats probably came from these same Vermont police, the college wisely hired private security for the graduation. In his message to Goddard graduates, Mumia never mentioned his own case. He spoke of major world challenges, such as wars in Gaza and Iraq, and the growing dangers to the planet. He discussed events in Ferguson and told the students of the importance of fighting for working people's interests. The voice of the voiceless, as Mumia has come to be known, called on those graduating to work for social change. He emphasized, quote, "Your job is to make a difference. Apply your knowledge in the real world and help be the change you are seeking to make," end quote. The full text of his talk can be found on prisonradio.org. Pennsylvania Corrections Secretary John Wetzel acknowledged that prisoners have a constitutional right to phone access and admitted at the time of the graduation that the state could not prohibit the address from happening. But the next day, on October 6th, Pennsylvania Governor Corbett, along with other right-wing politicians and members of the Fraternal Order of Police, gathered in Harrisburg to introduce legislation designed to silence Abu-Jamal and all other prisoners. Pennsylvania House Bill 2533 and Senate Bill 508, collectively known as the Re-victimization Relief Act, were quickly rushed through the state legislature. Despite an organized opposition call-in campaign and lobbying that took place on the 15th, it passed the House in a unanimous vote, October 15th, and one day later, it cleared the Pennsylvania Senate in an 11th hour, 37-11 vote. Corbett signed the bill on Tuesday, October 21st, in Philadelphia at 13th and Locust Streets, the site of the shooting of the Philadelphia police officer Daniel Faulkner, for which Mumia was convicted in 1982. This staged event was soundly disrupted by a boisterous protest. But I'm not going to tell you about that right now. So what is the significance of this law? In essence, on Tuesday, Governor Corbett tore up the First Amendment in the very city where the U.S. Constitution was penned. Pennsylvania Senator Dalen Leach, who voted against the bill, called it, quote, the most extreme violation of the First Amendment imaginable, end quote. Pennsylvania ACLU spokespeople described the bill as, quote, written so broadly it is unclear just what behavior is prohibited. Essentially, they say, any action by an inmate or a former offender that could cause mental anguish could be banned by a judge. Even before the bill passed, civil liberties groups, including the ACLU, promised to block the bill from ever being implemented. Mumia and Prison Radio have already obtained lawyers through the Abolitionist Law Center who will challenge the bill. Popularly referred to as the Silence Mumia Act or the Muzzle Mumia Bill, the RRA says that if prisoners speak in a manner that produces, quote, a temporary or permanent state of mental anguish, end quote, as defined by their alleged victims' families, a district attorney, or by the Pennsylvania Attorney General, they can be brought to court and sued for monetary charges. The bill isn't limited to current prisoners. It can be used against former inmates who might, once they're released, talk about conditions. And it can be used against anyone who amplifies the voices of prisoners. It would allow a court system to unilaterally stifle a prisoner's right to free speech and take legal action against media outlets and journalists who help disseminate prisoners' words and stories. It's unclear if this bill would apply outside the state of Pennsylvania. Ironically, and Mumia points this out, the U.S. Supreme Court, in an 8-1 ruling, upheld First Amendment protection for Fred Phelps and the Westboro Baptist Church to intentionally inflict emotional distress on the family of gay Marine Matthew Snyder, who had died in the Iraq War. Phelps publicly protested at Snyder's funeral. But the question remains whether the current right-leaning court would apply the same First Amendment protection to Mumia. This is by no means the first attempt of the state, and not just the state of Pennsylvania, but all the way up to the federal level, to silence Mumia. In 1996, our very own People's Video Network aired The Prison Industrial Complex, a conversation between our comrades Monica Moorhead, Larry Holmes, and Mumia. And the Pennsylvania State Prison immediately moved in to ban prisoners from being videotaped in the future. In 1997, Temple University, threatened with funding cuts by then-Governor Tom Ridge, canceled all Pacifica radio programming on its radio station WRTI because Pacifica's Democracy Now! Program was to air commentaries by Mumia. In 1999, Abu-Jamal successfully challenged an attempt by the state to prohibit him from writing after he published his first book, Live from Death Row. He has gone on to write 7 more books and record thousands of radio commentaries, many of which have been transcribed in the pages of Workers' Will newspaper. Prior to his incarceration, Mumia Abu-Jamal was an internationally celebrated, award-winning black writer and radio journalist, a former member of the Black Panther Party, and a one-time president of the Black Journalists Association. His writings and commentaries challenged Philadelphia's attack on the MOVE organization in 1978. They exposed the racism, brutality, and corruption of the Philadelphia Police Department. Mumia is credited with helping to lay the foundation of Philadelphia being one of the 2 police departments indicted by the U.S. Department of Justice for brutality and corruption. And at the same time, and this is important to keep in mind, there was a federal investigation going on that would lead to the conviction of 31 Philadelphia police officers. In 1981, Officer Faulkner, whom Mumia is accused of shooting, was working undercover inside the department, gathering evidence against his fellow officers. Many people suspect that this was the motive for framing Mumia for Faulkner's murder. The state of Pennsylvania has spent the last 30 years trying to silence Mumia, who maintains his innocence. So why take this extreme measure against him now? And by extension, not just Mumia, but journalists' access to prisoners, to all prisoners, and what they tell us about mass incarceration. The FRP is angry that they've been unable to execute Mumia. They tried twice. Now they seek to silence him in another way. Events around Ferguson have put police on the defensive. There's been growing exposure of mass incarceration of the nearly 3 million people in the U.S., the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world, and it's even being questioned by corporate media. The Re-victimization Relief Act allows the FOP to make themselves out as the victims, while muzzling the voices of millions of oppressed people they brutalize day in and day out. In addition to the ban on recording devices, you can't even bring a pen and pencil when you visit a prisoner in Pennsylvania. If this law goes unchallenged, all prisoners, not just Mumia, could see a severe restriction and possibly even the elimination of their phone call privileges, which they pay for, by the way. This latest effort to silence the movement for Abu-Jamal and against mass incarceration comes on the heels of growing militarization of police forces and NSA spying. Increasingly, the very forces charged with upholding the law are the ones most often violating it. This is also a time of growing social unrest, particularly among youth in the U.S. Look around. Everywhere you turn, there are signs of rising resistance to this rotten imperialist system, and not just in Ferguson or Gaza. Just weeks before this vote went down against Mumia in Harrisburg, Philadelphia experienced yet another week of protests against cuts in education and attacks on teachers. When the School Reform Commission tore up the teachers' contract 2 weeks ago, students responded with a strike, and they walked out of their classes. Yeah. When the SRC tried to premiere the anti-union pro-private school infomercial, AKA the documentary Won't Back Down, over a dozen students, members of Philadelphia Student Union, backed the administrators down by occupying the premiere, sitting on the floor and chanting, "We won't back down, Philly is a union town." And this was videoed. It's an interesting thing to see. PSU students had attended the celebration of life for Mumia Abu-Jamal in April, and one member wrote an essay in the group's newsletter this summer on what Mumia meant to her as a student at Benjamin Franklin High School, the school where Mumia had been a student organizer in the 1960s. And she voiced her outrage that her school had never told her this history. Disseminated via social media and independent news sources, Mumia's writings will influence a new generation of youth, particularly black and brown youth who stand in the crosshairs of police and vigilante violence, will influence them to take up the struggle he started decades ago. It already is. They might not know about Mumia's case, but when they turn to social media to learn more about police brutality, prisons, and resistance, they will find Mumia's voice on Democracy Now!, on Prison Radio, on RT, on Telesur, and we hope they'll look to Workers' World paper and our new FIST publication. I also want to mention something about the workers' role in this in Philadelphia. Just an aside, we had a honk on Wednesday for Mumia, and Ann was here and some other people from New York. It was pouring rain. But the cars going by that we got the best response from were cab drivers and an ambulance driver and the driver of a Philadelphia water department truck. They're trying to privatize it. And that's who was responding to us. So, it's important to know the background to this. While seriously underfunding public education in Pennsylvania, Governor Corbett has spent billions of dollars to construct new prisons, and he gave over $100 million to private attorneys to unsuccessfully defend legislation he's passed that also violated constitutional rights, including a regressive voter ID law and a ban on gay marriage. Last week, over 3,000 teachers, students, and others stopped traffic outside the SRC building. Last week, 50 union leaders signed on to a letter in support of the teachers, with many publicly calling for a citywide general strike if the SRC does not back down. One of those most vocal about the strike call was Henry Nicholas, head of 1199C, which represents healthcare workers in Philly, and who opened his union hall for a pro-Mumia press conference this week. Yeah. A lot of people see Corbett's signing of this bill as a Hail Mary pass. I hope you're all familiar with that term. Corbett's up for re-election in November, but he is seriously trailing his opponent, who won the backing of the Fraternal Order of Police. It's a big shift. In the last few years, there have been so many protests staged against Corbett that he usually hides behind closed doors, and in one case even changed his venue to avoid direct public confrontation. So I want to give some background on this protest. Some 60 groups and individuals, including Workers' World Party, signed on to a call to action against the silencing of constitutionally protected prisoner speech in Pennsylvania. That was the name of the call. Initiated by the New York Free Mumia Coalition, Prison Radio, and the Campaign to Bring Mumia Home. Roots Action also issued a petition signed by over 10,000 people condemning the legislation. So we had already been planning to hold a press conference about this. We were going to organize a honk, which we did, against police brutality and mass incarceration, and a town hall meeting, all to take place on October 22nd, which was the National Day Against Police Brutality. But then we found out that Corbett was going to sign the bill in Philadelphia on Tuesday, and we had less than 24 hours to organize to confront that. So through a lot of series of phone calls and emails, we figured, if we were lucky, we'd have about a dozen people. And we asked people to meet at Broad and Locust, which was 2 blocks from where Corbett's stage was going to be set up. We really thought this was the closest we were going to get. We thought there would be so many police around that, that they would block us. Some of us got there early, and we did some scouting around to see where the cops were gathered. But at the same time, we were having trouble figuring out where all of our forces were. In typical Philly fashion, most people arrived late. But the power of the people's movement was with us that day. Somehow we managed to group up. We circled around the cops via this little alley. Philly has a lot of alleys like Lower Manhattan. And we ended up, as we hit Locust Street, we realized we were a stone's throw away from the stage where Corbett was speaking. And there were no cops to stop us from being that close. So we ended up being able to, really drown out his rally. Several protesters wore orange prison-style jumpsuits and carried signs depicting the kinds of activities that would be banned under the legislation intended to muffle Mumia. One sign read, "I spoke against abuse in prison, and Corbett and the FOP want to silence me." We also had a huge paper banner with Mumia's statement, which reads, "I welcome Governor Corbett's signature on an unconstitutional bill that proves that the Pennsylvania executive and the legislature don't give one whit about the Constitution of the Commonwealth or the U.S. Constitution. It proves that they are the outlaws," end quote. Our forces, disorganized as we were, grew to nearly 50 protesters who kept up constant chants of "Our brother Mumia is under attack. What do? Stand up, fight back." And "One term Tom, one term Tom." And "Fund schools, not jails." And so, there was actually somebody on the podium with the press who told us afterwards that, we were so loud that you couldn't hear Corbett speak. We also noticed something else. When Corbett, well, there was a couple things. When Corbett signed this bill on Tuesday, it was the first time that he was unable to hide from demonstrators. And Comrade Joe Piette has a picture of the stage where Corbett was signing this bill. And what stands out is the ugly racial image of Corbett lined up largely with white supporters at the site of Faulkner's death. And ironically, at the very time Corbett was signing yet another bill to take away rights of Pennsylvanians, a court in the state voted in support of restoring the Philadelphia Teachers Union contract. This outlaw legislation is a blatant attempt on First Amendment rights, but as Sister Ramona Africa described the bill at our press conference on Wednesday, it's really just a meaningless piece of paper. She said, they can't take away our freedom of speech if we don't let them. The power is in the hands of the people, and the state knows this. This fight back outlook is being reflected in the actions that have greeted the passage of this regressive bill. Groups that barely work together are standing on the same podium, signing the same call. Media from Democracy Now!, Word Radio, and others are interviewing Mumia and spreading his message. And we want to do the same thing tonight. So we're going to play a recording from Mumia that aired on October 20th, 2 days before the bill that would ban it was signed.
A nation in fear. Look at the United States. Really, look at it. From north to south, east to west, from sea to shining sea. And you'll see the frenzy of fear. Fear of Ebola, fear of ISIS, fear of crime, fear of fear. The reason? Well, fear sells. It sells papers, attracts viewers, and pulls listeners. The national media is a virtual fear industry. There used to be an old adage in TV news, if it bleeds, it leads. There is so much fear in this country that it can barely breathe. And for politicians, that's fine. For they know that fear is fuel, a power unto itself that can be ridden like a maddened steed to more power. 2 nurses catch the Ebola virus, and this only because they weren't properly protected. And schools are closed, quarantine orders are issued, and sheer, unadulterated hysteria, hyped by ratings-hungry media, travels the land like a flood. Much of American history may be seen as frenzies of fear, which, once unleashed, drove social policies that often did more harm than that which was first feared. The fears of Salem ignited wars against so-called witches and monstrous tortures of women. The fears of black slave rebellions led to waves of repression and racist violence. The fear of the ability of drugs to expand minds led to the so-called war on drugs, which fed a prison industrial complex that swept millions into the biggest prison boom in history, with little, if any, effect on drug usage. Fear, frenzy, fuels for media and politicians, and disaster. From Imprisoned Nation, this is Mumia Abu-Jamal.
I hope this doesn't upset anybody, but we have probably just participated in a violation of the Re-victimization Relief Act. And we need to do more of that. This bill will be challenged in the courts, but the best way to defeat it and all attempts at state repression is through the collective power of the people via demonstrations in the streets and acts of civil disobedience. Our challenge is to seek every opportunity to broadcast Mumia's messages. Share his tapes via social media, whatever you use, Twitter, Facebook, email. You can go to Prison Radio and get the URL for them. Organize meetings in your neighborhood, your school or union. Make the state of Pennsylvania file so many lawsuits against the resistance movement that the justice system grinds to a halt. Mumia speaks about the fear disseminated by corporate media, but to borrow on the old adage, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Our brother Mumia is challenging the system from behind the walls. Our challenge is to carry out this fight outside the prison walls in the general population. So brick by brick, wall by wall, let's free Mumia Abu-Jamal. Brick by brick, wall by wall, let's free Mumia and free them all.